She was carrying a tray of cheap coffee and unpaid bills. He owned half the city and all of its secrets when he raised his voice at her in front of a packed restaurant. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't apologize. She leaned in close, looked him dead in the eye, and said 7 words that no one had ever dared say to him in his entire life. The restaurant went silent. His bodyguards reached for their weapons. And Diego Caruso, the most feared man in Chicago, did something nobody expected. He smiled. That smile would change everything. The Rosewood Grill had seen better days. It sat wedged between a dry cleaner and a closed-down pharmacy on the corner of West Hubbard and North Wells, in a neighborhood that Chicago's tourism board had quietly stopped mentioning in its brochures. The neon O in the sign had been burned out since March, so it read, "The R. Seawood Grill," to anyone passing by at night, which wasn't exactly the image management had been hoping for. The leather booth seats were cracked, the bar stools wobbled, and the kitchen's hood fan made a sound like a dying animal every time someone ordered something that required high heat. But the food was honest, the portions were generous, and the coffee, God, the coffee was extraordinary. People came from 3 neighborhoods over for that coffee. It was the kind of coffee that made you feel like someone actually gave a damn about something, which, in this part of town, was rarer than you'd think. Camilla Donovan had been working double shifts at the Rosewood Grill for going on 3 years. She was 27, sharp-eyed, dark-haired, with the kind of bone-tired competence that comes from carrying too much for too long. She had a 4-year-old daughter named Rosie at home with her neighbor Mrs. Kowalski, a busted radiator she'd been promised would be fixed by November, and exactly $214 in her savings account, which she kept a post-it note about in her apron pocket. Less as a budget reminder, and more as a kind of punishment. A daily reminder not to get comfortable. Because comfortable wasn't something the universe seemed interested in letting her be. She had wanted to be a nurse. She'd done 2 years of nursing school at DePaul before her mother's medical bills had swallowed the tuition money whole. She didn't resent it. That was just life. You make choices, and some choices get made for you, and eventually you stop drawing the line between the two. On the night that everything changed, and she would later be able to describe it in granular, almost cinematic detail, right down to the way the rain sounded against the window, and the fact that she was wearing the apron with the slightly frayed left pocket, the restaurant was about 2/3 full. It was a Thursday, late October, the kind of cold that Chicago serves up as a preview, a warning of what's coming. The dinner rush had peaked and was beginning to ebb. Camilla was refilling coffee for old Pete Dalgleish at the counter. Pete came in every night and ordered coffee and the soup and sat there for 2 hours reading his newspaper like the concept of the internet had never occurred to him, which Camilla appreciated more than she could say when the front door opened. She didn't look up immediately. She never looked up immediately anymore. It was a habit she'd developed as a form of self-protection, a micro-delay between reality and having to respond to it. She heard the door, heard the cold air push in, heard 4 or 5 sets of footsteps that were heavier and more deliberate than the usual Thursday night shuffle. Then she looked up. There were 5 of them. 4 wore dark coats, stood at angles to the room, and had the kind of stillness that isn't natural, it's trained. The kind of stillness that means they're watching everything and reacting to nothing, and that they could, if called upon, do something very fast and very decisive and feel absolutely nothing about it afterward. They moved like they were used to moving in formation, used to being an extension of someone else's will. The someone else was in the middle. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and dark eyes that swept the room, not with curiosity, but with assessment. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Camilla made in 3 months, and a black wool overcoat that hung off his shoulders with the casual authority of a man who had never once in his adult life worried about whether he could afford a coat. His hair was dark and cut close, with just enough grey at the temples to tell you he was somewhere in his late 30s, and had arrived there through experiences that left marks. His face was not unkind, exactly, but it was not warm either. It was the face of a man who had learned to use charm the way other people use tools functionally, deliberately, and only when necessary. Camilla recognized him, not personally, but the way you recognize a storm before it arrives, by the way the air changes around it. His name was Diego Caruso. She knew the name because everyone in Chicago knew the name, the same way everyone in Chicago knew certain intersections you didn't linger at past midnight, or certain blocks where the trash pickup happened with suspicious reliability, regardless of city schedules. Diego Caruso was the name that appeared in the Tribune occasionally, usually in a story that used phrases like alleged ties to organized crime, or no charges were filed, or sources close to the investigation declined to comment. He was the name that Assistant District Attorney Patrick Holloway had been building a case around for 2 years, according to the news, a case that kept hitting procedural walls and witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember things. Diego Caruso was, by every account that Camilla had ever heard, the kind of man that reasonable people did not antagonize. He sat down at table 7. Table 7 was, in the professional judgment of every server who had ever worked the Rosewood Grill, the worst table in the house. It was too close to the kitchen door, which swung open every 40 seconds. The lighting above it flickered occasionally for no reason that the electrician who'd been called 3 times could explain. One leg was slightly shorter than the others, so the table rocked gently whenever anyone rested their elbows on it. It had been reserved that night for a birthday party of 8 that had called an hour ago to cancel, and it was the only table large enough to accommodate 5 people on short notice. Camilla picked up 5 menus, walked over, and set them down with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become pure muscle memory. "Good evening," she said. "Can I start you all off with drinks?" His name was Diego Caruso, and he had not chosen this restaurant. That fact was important to him, though he wouldn't have admitted it. He was precise about his habits, meticulous about his environments. He ate at places he controlled, or at places that controlled themselves with such legendary consistency that the control was a given. He ate at Spiaggia on Michigan Avenue, where the maitre d' knew his table and kept it empty from 8 o'clock onward, just in case. He ate at a small, unmarked trattoria on North Dearborn that his family had owned through a shell company for 11 years. He did not eat at places called the Rosewood Grill that had burned out letters in their signs. He was here because of Tommy Abruzzo. Tommy Abruzzo was 34 years old, ran the Caruso family's operations in the River North Corridor, and had the organizational instincts of a golden retriever, enthusiastic, eager, and incapable of holding 2 thoughts simultaneously. Tommy had suggested this restaurant for a low-profile meeting with a man named Gregor Voss, a logistics contact from out of town who had requested somewhere off the radar. Tommy had apparently chosen it by pointing at a map with his eyes closed, or possibly by asking his teenage cousin. because nothing about the rosewood grill suggested forethought. Diego had arrived to find Gregor Voss was running 30 minutes late. Diego was not good at waiting. He had never been required to develop the skill. He sat at table 7 and immediately felt the table rock. He felt the kitchen door swing open and release a gust of heat and the smell of frying onions every 45 seconds. He noticed the light above him flicker twice in 3 minutes. He was not in a good mood before the waitress arrived, and by the time she set down the menus, he was in a significantly worse one. "The Pellegrino," he said, not looking up from his phone, because he had received a message from his attorney, Richard Calloway, that required his attention. "Has to be cold, not cold enough. Last time." "We don't carry Pellegrino," Camilla said. He looked up. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. There was no apology in it, no trailing softness, no attempt to cushion it. She said it the way you state a fact. Water is wet. The sky is grey. We don't carry Pellegrino as if the absence of the thing was simply a condition of reality and not a personal failing. "The restaurant on Dearborn carries Pellegrino," he said. "Then I'd suggest the restaurant on Dearborn." She paused one beat. "Sir." One of his men, Saul, who had been with Diego for 9 years and had seen many things, made a sound that may have been the beginning of a laugh, instantly suppressed. "Sparkling water," Diego said flatly. "Whatever you have." "We have Perrier." "Fine." She moved away and took the other drink orders with clean, efficient dispatch, and Diego returned to his phone, but a small part of his attention stayed on her, not consciously, not with intent, just the instinctive tracking of something that had surprised him, the way the mind snagged on the unexpected. The next 20 minutes were not improved by Gregor Voss continuing not to arrive. Diego ordered for the table. He ordered without looking at the menu, partly because he didn't particularly care what he ate here, and partly because it was a habit he made decisions quickly, committed to them without review, and moved on. He ordered the steak, medium rare, for himself. He ordered sides for the table. He was specific about the steak, in the way that men who are accustomed to getting what they want are specific about everything, no sauce on the plate. Not to the side, not at all. The steak separated, not touching the vegetables. Done correctly. The steak arrived touching the vegetables. It was a small thing, an objectively trivial thing, in the architecture of the problems Diego Caruso managed on any given day. He managed problems that involved money in numbers that had too many zeros to be real, problems that involved men who carried weapons and bad intentions, problems that involved judges and lawyers and city councilmen whose names appeared on ballots and also on other documents that were never meant to be public. A steak touching some asparagus should not have registered. But the Gregor Voss meeting was now 45 minutes delayed. His attorney Richard Calloway had sent 2 more messages that were increasingly urgent in their subtext. The table had rocked 4 times, and the kitchen door had opened directly into the back of his chair twice in the last 10 minutes. And Diego Caruso was a man who had learned to recognize the accumulation of friction as a kind of offense. "I said the steak separated." He said it sharply, loudly enough that the table next to them glanced over. "Not touching. Does that require translation?" Camilla looked at the plate. She looked at him. She had been on her feet for 9 hours. She had spilled coffee on her shoe at noon, and her sock had been cold and wet all day. She had texted Mrs. Kowalski during her break to learn that Rosie had a slight temperature that wasn't dangerous but wasn't nothing, and that fact had been sitting in the back of her chest like a small, steady pressure ever since. She had been spoken to with varying degrees of condescension by approximately 11 people today, and she had absorbed each one with the professional surface of a woman who needed this job and understood the economics of needing a job. She was very, very tired. "The cook placed it that way," she said, keeping her voice level. "I can take it back. The cook placed it that way because you didn't relay the order correctly. I relayed the order correctly. Then the result suggests otherwise. The result suggests the cook made an error." She held his gaze. "I'll have it corrected." She reached for the plate. "Don't bother." He pushed back from the table slightly, and his voice went up another register, not a shout. Exactly. But a voice raised in a restaurant in a way that silences the tables around it. What kind of place serves a guest like this? Where is the manager? Is there a manager? Or is this entire operation running itself into the ground on its own? The restaurant went quiet. Not completely. There was still the background noise of the kitchen, the distant murmur of the bar, but the tables within range had gone still. Old Pete Dalglish had lowered his newspaper. The couple in the corner booth were no longer looking at each other. Camilla set the plate back on the table. She straightened up. She looked at Diego Caruso with the kind of eyes that have been pushed past a certain threshold and have stopped performing composure. And she leaned forward, just slightly, and said it. "Shout at me again, and I'll end you." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Sal, who had seen many things, very carefully looked at a point on the wall approximately 18 inches to the left of where Camilla was standing. The other 3 men at the table achieved similar feats of deliberate inattention. No one moved. No one reached for anything. Not because they weren't capable of decisive action, they were, categorically, extremely capable, but because they understood, with the survivor's instinct for reading rooms, that this was not that kind of moment. Diego Caruso looked at Camilla Donovan. He had been threatened before. He had been threatened by men who meant it, men with resources and history, and the specific kind of resolve that comes from having nothing left to lose. He had been threatened by professionals who'd said it quietly and meant it precisely. He had, once, been threatened by a federal prosecutor in a conference room who'd laid out a case file with the careful deliberation of a man who had been building it for 4 years and believed in it with religious conviction. He had never been threatened by a waitress in a cracked leather booth restaurant with a broken letter in its sign. He had never been threatened with such complete, unconcealed exhaustion, because that was what he heard in it. Not bravado, not performance. He heard a woman who had been awake for too long, carrying too much, and had simply reached the end of the very long rope she'd been holding. The threat wasn't calculated. It wasn't strategic. It was honest, which was a thing Diego Caruso encountered so rarely in his professional life that he sometimes forgot what it sounded like. Then he did something. He smiled. It started at the corner of his mouth and moved slowly, with the quality of something unfamiliar, as if the muscles involved were working from memory rather than habit. But it was real. Sal, who had been with him 9 years and had catalogued his expressions with the precision of a man who understood that reading his employer correctly was a professional survival skill, would later say it was the most genuine smile he'd seen from Diego in at least 2 years. "Sit down," he said. Not to her, to the table, to the implicit tension. He said it the way you say, "Stand down," and the room released itself, and the surrounding tables resumed their dinners with the carefully performed naturalness of people pretending they hadn't been holding their breath. He looked at her. "What's your name?" She held herself straight. "Camilla." "Camilla." He said it like he was checking whether it fit. "I apologize for raising my voice." He said this with the practiced delivery of a man who says it rarely enough that it doesn't quite come naturally, but who says it anyway, because he has decided it is the correct thing to say in this instance. It was the table and the evening, and none of that is your fault. She stared at him for a long moment, as if she was trying to locate the catch. "I'll have the steak corrected," she said finally. "Don't." He picked up his fork. "It's fine." The Gregor Voss meeting happened at 9:15 in the back corner of the restaurant and lasted 40 minutes. Camilla refilled coffee twice and kept her distance, which was natural enough that it required no effort. She was a professional. She kept her section running. She kept her expression neutral, and she did not allow herself to process the earlier exchange beyond noting, clinically, that she appeared to still be employed. At 10:30, Diego Caruso's table settled the check. The bill was $340. The cash left on the table was $600. No card, no receipt, no ceremony about it, just $600 in 50s, tucked under the water glass like it was a normal thing. Camilla picked it up and stood very still for approximately 4 seconds, doing math. She carried the difference to the host station, because she wasn't a person who took things that weren't clearly hers, and she wasn't certain what this was. Kevin, the manager on duty, Kevin Marsh, 22 years old, perpetually overwhelmed, wearing a tie that was too wide for his face, told her to keep it. That Diego Caruso's people always settled in cash and always over-tipped by a margin that was less generosity and more statement, and that she should go home before she fell over. She didn't fall over. She went home. She paid Mrs. Kowalski the extra $5 she owed her from last week. Checked on Rosie asleep. Temperature down. Small miracle. And sat in the kitchen with a cup of her own coffee and the $260 tip in her hand. She didn't sleep well. He came back the following Tuesday. She found out from Kevin, who appeared at her elbow at 5:50 with the energy of a man who has been handed information he doesn't know what to do with and has been physically distressed by it for 20 minutes. He called ahead, Kevin said, as if this were the most unusual aspect of the situation, which suggested Kevin did not have a clear sense of which aspects were unusual and which were alarming. He asked for table 7. Table 7 is the worst table in the house, Camilla said. I know. He specifically asked. She thought about this. And he asked for you, Kevin added, and looked immediately as if he regretted being the one to say it. At 6 o'clock, Diego Caruso arrived with 2 men instead of 4, and sat at table 7, and when Camilla came to take his order, he said, without preamble, "The coffee, that's what it is. I had it last week, and I've been thinking about it." "The coffee," Camilla repeated. "It's not Colombian. It's not Ethiopian. There's something in the roast I can't place." He looked at her with the directness of a man who expects answers, because he has always received them. "What is it?" This was not, by any measure, the conversation Camilla had prepared herself for. She had prepared for something awkward, an acknowledgement of the previous week. Perhaps, or worse, no acknowledgement at all, and a return to the same dynamic that had created the first crisis. She had not prepared for a question about coffee. "It's a blend," she said. "The owner sources it from a roaster in Pilsen. A woman named Anna Torres runs the place. She blends Guatemalan and Sumatran with a small percentage of Robusta. I don't know the exact ratio." He nodded slowly, like she'd given him a piece of information he'd been looking for. "Sit down," he said. "I'm working. Kevin will survive." He glanced at Kevin, who was standing 20 feet away, doing an impressive impression of a person who was not watching them. Kevin, correctly reading the glance, made a gesture that was simultaneously a nod and a retreat. 5 minutes. "Tell me about the coffee." She sat down. She sat down because she needed the job, and because she was curious in spite of herself, and because the simple truth was that she liked talking about the coffee. Ana Torres had been coming in for 2 years, sitting at the counter, drinking her own blend and talking to anyone who would listen about origin and process, and the specific chemistry of why a small percentage of Robusta gave a blend an edge that straight Arabica couldn't reproduce. Camilla had absorbed it like a person absorbs things they love without meaning to. She told him about Guatemala's volcanic soil. She told him about the wet processing method and why it created the clarity he was tasting. She told him about the Robusta and why most specialty roasters dismissed it, and why Ana Torres thought that was snobbery masquerading as taste. Diego Caruso listened with a quality of attention that was different from the performance of listening, different from the nodding and the eye contact that people do to signal engagement. He actually listened. She could tell because he didn't say anything until she was finished. And when he did speak, the question he asked was specific and followed directly from something she'd said, rather than being a general response designed to convey interest. "This woman, Torres," he said. "She has a shop in Pilsen, a roastery. She doesn't really sell retail. She supplies restaurants, mostly." "I'd like the address." Camilla looked at him. "I'm not sure that's my information to give." Something moved in his expression. Surprise. She thought, or something in the same family as surprise. "I want to order coffee," he said, and the simplicity of it landed with unexpected weight, because she realized that he was telling the truth, and also that he probably wasn't used to needing to explain truthful things. "I'll ask her," Camilla said. "If she's comfortable with it. I'll let you know." He looked at her for a long moment. "You'll let me know," he repeated. "I'll let you know." She stood up. "Can I take your order?" The dinner lasted an hour and a half. He ordered the steak again correctly this time, and a bottle of wine that Kevin had to run to the back room to locate because it wasn't on the regular menu, but apparently existed in a case someone had delivered at some point and never reconciled with the inventory. He ate, and he spoke quietly with his 2 men, and he drank his coffee with the focused appreciation of someone who now had context for what they were tasting. When he left, the bill was paid in cash again. The tip was $300. Camilla texted Ana Torres that night. Ana called back in 4 minutes, which meant she'd been up. It was 11:15, and her first question was, "How big is his operation?" And her second question was, "Does he actually understand coffee, or is this a flex?" And her third question was, "Tell me honestly, is he attractive?" Camilla answered large, genuine, and none of your business, respectively. And Ana laughed for 30 seconds and said she'd think about it. She called back the next morning and said yes. He came back Thursday, and he brought Ana Torres's business card with him, which she had apparently mailed to an address he'd sent her. Camilla didn't ask with a note that said, "For the man with the right questions." He set it on the counter when he arrived, as if it were a receipt he was returning. She sent it to you directly, Camilla said. She did. We had a phone conversation. He settled onto a counter stool, not a booth this time, just the stool next to Pete Dalglish, who looked at him once, assessed him with the long practice of a man who had been reading people in this restaurant for 11 years, and returned to his newspaper. She's interesting. She's extraordinary, Camilla said, and meant it. She says the same about you. Camilla looked up. She says you're the reason she keeps supplying this place, Diego said, when she has 3 restaurants on the North Shore offering to pay double what she charges here. She said you understand what she's doing. He paused. Do you always do that? Make people feel like what they're doing matters. I don't do it strategically, she said, which was the honest answer. That's what makes it effective. She busied herself with coffee, because the alternative was standing still. And standing still felt suddenly inadvisable. Tell me something, he said. That first night, when you said what you said? She set down the coffee pot. I need this job. I know. So I wasn't trying to make a point or a statement. I was tired. I know that too. He looked at her directly, the way he seemed to do everything with full, undivided commitment, as if he had decided to look at something and intended to actually see it. That's not why I keep coming back. The words landed differently than she expected. Not as a declaration he wasn't performing anything, wasn't leaning in with intent. He said it the way he said everything factually. Why do you keep coming back? She asked. This is the only table in the city where someone talks to me like I'm a person who can be corrected. She almost laughed and caught herself. That's a very low bar. It's the bar I have. Over the following 3 weeks, Diego Caruso came in 5 more times. He always sat at table 7, which remained the worst table in the house, and which he seemed to have developed an attachment to that was either symbolic or pathological. He came in twice with his men, twice alone, and once with a man Camilla didn't recognize, late 50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that was in a completely different register of expensive, with the specific bearing of someone who had been important long enough that it had stopped being an event and become a permanent state. She heard the older man call Diego by name, and heard Diego call him Uncle Bernard, and she stored the name without examining it, the way you store things you're not sure you want to know. She and Diego talked, not at length. Never for long she had a section to run. He had the specific gravity of a man who existed at the center of things that required his attention, but in the margins, in the intervals between orders and refills and the management of a restaurant floor. He asked her questions with the precision of a man who had learned that asking precise questions was more efficient than broad ones, and he remembered everything she said. She knew this because 3 visits later, he referenced something she'd mentioned in passing about Rosie's favorite color, yellow, specifically the color of the drawing on the refrigerator, and used it naturally, without theatrical callback, just as a detail he had absorbed and retained. She was careful. She was careful because she was not naive, and because she knew what his name meant in this city, and because she had a 4-year-old daughter and $214 in her savings account, and 0 tolerance for the introduction of further complexity into her life. She was careful because she'd had her one experience with a man who was exciting and dangerous and full of confidence, and that man was now a voice on the phone who called sporadically and sent birthday money 3 weeks late, and whose name was Preston Cole, and who represented. In her personal history, a master class in the specific damage that charm without substance could do. She was careful, but she was also awake in a way she hadn't been in a while. The crisis arrived on a Wednesday. It arrived in the form of a man named Derek Vance, no relation to any established criminal infrastructure that Camilla was aware of. Just an ordinary, civilian-grade disaster who had been Rosie's daycare coordinator and who had, over the summer, borrowed $400 from Camilla with a detailed and convincing story about a temporary cash flow problem, and who had stopped returning calls in September, and who walked into the Rosewood Grill at 7:30 on a Wednesday night with a woman who was clearly a date and sat down in Section 4 and ordered appetizers. Camilla saw him from across the room. She felt the particular cold clarity of recognizing someone who owes you money and is currently spending money on mozzarella sticks. She was not violent. She was not the kind of person who made scenes. She did not intend to make a scene. But she was also 9.5 hours into a double shift and was already operating at approximately 3% above her emotional threshold, and the $400 was not a small number in her particular arithmetic, and something happened to her face that Kevin, perceptive, finally, in this one specific instance, noticed immediately. "I'll take Section 4 tonight," he said, appearing at her elbow. "I've got it. Camilla, I've got it. Kevin." She walked over to the table with a level of professional control that she would later feel genuinely proud of. She set down the menus. She asked for drink orders. She did not make eye contact with Derek Vance for a count of 4, and when she did, she kept her voice entirely steady and said, "Good evening." "Derek." He went pale. He had the look of a man who had calculated that this was unlikely and was now experiencing the consequences of that calculation. "Camilla," he said. "Hey, this is awkward. What can I get you to drink?" The date looked between them with the specific discomfort of someone who has arrived at a location without adequate intelligence. "Camilla, listen, about the money. I'm not discussing that right now," she said. "You're a guest." "Drinks," he ordered. She walked away. She made it to the service station before her hands started shaking slightly, not from distress. Exactly. More from the effort of containment. The specific physical cost of holding everything very still when everything wants to move. She stood with her back to the room and breathed and did the math for the 100th time on whether $400 was a thing she could afford to have lost. And the answer was still no, and was going to remain no. She didn't hear him approach. "Something's wrong," Diego said. She turned around. He was sitting at the counter he'd come in at 7. She'd taken his order. She'd been so controlled in her management of the Derek Vance table that she'd nearly forgotten. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're doing the thing where you make your face very neutral to compensate for the thing behind your face not being neutral." She stared at him. "You've known me for 3 weeks. I'm observant," she told him. She didn't plan to. It was just that he asked with the specific quality of attention that she'd come to associate with him. The complete presence kind. And she was tired, and Derek Vance was 18 feet away ordering a second round of appetizers. And it came out, $400, borrowed in August, the whole story. Diego listened. "Which table?" he said. "No," Camilla said immediately. "I'm not going to do anything." "I know what you are," she said, not unkindly, just precisely. "I know what I'm not going to do anything means from someone like you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move in his expression that she couldn't quite name something in the territory of being truly seen and responding to it with an honesty that wasn't comfortable. "Table number," he said. "Absolutely not." He nodded slowly and returned to his coffee. Derek Vance paid his check, left a 17% tip, and walked out at 9 o'clock. Camilla ran her side work, rolled silverware, and tried not to think about the $400. At 9:30, Kevin appeared again with the particular expression of a man who has received information he is unclear about. Derek Vance left an envelope at the host stand. He said, "It has your name on it." Inside the envelope was $400 in cash and a handwritten note on a napkin that said, "With interest." I'm sorry. The note was in Derek's handwriting. She was certain of that. She was also certain that Derek had not, on his own initiative, returned $400 to anyone, ever, in his adult life. She looked across the restaurant at the counter. Diego was reading his phone. She walked over. "You said you weren't going to do anything." "I didn't do anything," he said, without looking up. "I had a brief, entirely civil conversation with a man who realized he had made an error in his personal accounting." "Diego." He looked up. It was the first time she had said his name. They both registered this. "Don't do that again," she said. "He owes you money. It's my problem to solve." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said finally. "I know it is." A pause. "I didn't like watching you stand at that service station with your hands shaking." The words were simple. They landed without performance or calculation. She stood there with the napkin in her hand and understood, with the specific clarity of a woman who has learned to trust her instincts because they are among the few reliable things she owns, that she was in serious trouble. His full name was Diego Marco Caruso, and he had been born in Bridgeport to a father who was absent and a mother named Lucia, who was the most competent person he had ever met in his life, and who had died of a stroke 6 years ago, a fact that still lived in his chest like a stone he'd learned to carry rather than set down. His uncle, Bernard Caruso, the silver-haired man from the restaurant, had raised him from 13 onward, which meant that his education had been equal parts the streets of Bridgeport and his uncle's particular philosophy of power, which held that the best kind of power was the kind that people didn't see coming until they were already inside it. Bernard was 71 now, and still conducted himself with the authority of a man who built something from nothing and hasn't forgotten the weight of the beginning. Diego had built things of his own, things that appeared in financial filings as legitimate real estate holdings and logistics companies and hospitality investments, and things that didn't appear anywhere at all except in the specific, layered architecture of obligations and arrangements that constituted the actual nature of his position in Chicago. He was 41 years old and had more money than he would spend in 4 lifetimes, and a loneliness that he had learned to manage through motion, always in motion, always occupied, always the gravitational center of something, because stillness was when it surfaced. He had been married once. Her name was Gabriella, and she had been beautiful and quick and had understood exactly what she was marrying, and had decided 3 years in. That understanding a thing and living inside it were different problems. The divorce had been expensive, and civil, and utterly without drama, which was its own kind of damage. They had both been too controlled for the release of actual conflict. She lived in San Francisco now, with an architect named Stephen Park, and sent Christmas cards that Diego received and did not respond to, and did not throw away. He had not been in this kind of trouble since Gabriella. He knew it was trouble. He was not a man who confused himself about things. Camilla Donovan was a waitress with a daughter and a broken radiator and a savings account that didn't have enough zeros, and she looked at him like a person who made decisions for herself and was fully prepared to end the conversation before it became a problem. And he had been to her restaurant 9 times in 3 weeks and was thinking about the coffee that was really, transparently, not about the coffee. He had also not told her certain things. He had not told her about the ADA Patrick Holloway and the 2-year investigation. He had not told her that 3 weeks ago. A man who had worked for his family for 15 years, a man named Bobby Lau, had been arrested on federal racketeering charges, and that the pressure being applied to Bobby was of a kind that tested loyalty in significant ways. He had not told her that certain people in his world would view his repeated presence at a modest restaurant in River North as information, a detail about his habits, a pattern that could be exploited. He had not told her these things because he had been, for the first time in a long time, experiencing something he had almost forgotten, the specific relief of a space that was not about any of that. Just coffee, and a woman who corrected him when he was wrong, and the worst table in the house. On the 4th Tuesday of November, his attorney Richard Calloway called at 6:15 to tell him that Bobby Lau had provided information to federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, and that the information included details about properties and financial arrangements that would significantly accelerate the timeline of Patrick Holloway's case. Diego sat in his car outside the Rosewood Grill for 7 minutes. Then he went inside. She knew something was different immediately. It wasn't visible in any obvious way. His face was as controlled as ever, his bearing as deliberate. But she had been watching him for 3 weeks with the involuntary attention of a person who can't stop watching something, and she had catalogued enough to read the texture of how he occupied a room. Tonight he occupied it differently. He was present but pulled inward, the way a tide pulls before a wave. She brought coffee without being asked. She sat down across from him. Kevin had stopped even pretending to object and waited. "I may not be coming back for a while," he said. She was careful with her face. "Okay. There are things that are going to require my attention." "Okay." He looked at her. "You're not going to ask. It's not my information," she said. Something shifted in his expression, cracked, slightly, at the edges, in a way she'd never seen before. He looked, for a moment, like a person rather than a position. "There's a case," he said. "Federal. It's been building for 2 years, and someone I trusted gave them something they needed, and the next several months are going to be..." He stopped. "Complicated. Are you safe?" The question surprised him. She could see it surprise him. She guessed that most people in his world, when confronted with this news, asked about exposure, about legal strategy, about which judges were in play. She guessed no one had asked if he was safe. "Physically," he said. "Yes, legally." He made a small motion with his hand that encompassed the ambiguity. "Do you have a good lawyer?" "The best one I know how to pay for." "Then use them," she said. "And be honest with them, even about the things that are embarrassing or difficult. The lawyer can't work with what you don't give them." He looked at her for a long moment. "You sound like you've done this." "I've watched enough courtroom procedurals," she said, which was not entirely true. She'd also spent 2 years watching her mother navigate a medical malpractice claim with a lawyer who was only as effective as the information she'd been given, but the joke landed right, and he did the thing with his mouth that was his version of a laugh. "Camilla," He said her name with the specific weight of a person who has been deciding whether to say a thing for longer than the conversation has lasted. When this is resolved, "Don't," she said gently. "Don't what?" "Don't make a promise that belongs to a version of the future you can't see yet." He was quiet. "But," she said, and picked up his coffee cup to refill it, because her hands needed something to do. "I'll still be here." The federal case against Diego Caruso's operation moved fast in December, and then stalled unexpectedly in January. Camilla followed it, the way you follow something you're trying not to follow in fragments, obliquely. When the news happened to surface near her attention, the Tribune covered it twice. The second piece, written by a reporter named Sandra Voigt, whose byline she'd come to recognize, noted that ADA Patrick Holloway's key witness had provided documentation that proved, upon examination, to have been maintained in a way that created significant chain of custody questions that Diego's attorney, Richard Calloway, had raised in a preliminary hearing with the kind of clinical precision that suggested preparation rather than improvisation. In March, she read that 2 of the central charges had been dismissed. In April, 3 more. In May, Patrick Holloway held a press conference that was described, in the phrasing of every journalist who covered it, as measured, which is the word journalists use when they mean defeat delivered with dignity. The case wasn't over. There were remaining threads. Ongoing review. The specific momentum of a federal investigation that never fully stops so much as slows to a pace indistinguishable from stopping, but the acute crisis had passed. She knew this not only from the Tribune, but from Ana Torres, who had apparently developed a direct line of communication with various people and called Camilla in May to say, with the satisfaction of someone delivering information they've been holding, "Your coffee man is okay." "He's not my coffee man," Camilla said. "Camilla. Ana. He came into the roastery," Ana said. "In person. Bought 6 months of supply wholesale. Asked me to tell you. A pause. Which Ana was deploying for effect, and both of them knew it, that he'd be coming by Thursday." He came in on Thursday at 6 o'clock. He sat at table 7. He looked the same, and also different. There was something marginally less armored about him. The specific quality of a man who has been tested recently and has come through it without pretending the test didn't happen. She brought coffee without being asked. She sat down. "The table still rocks," he said. "It always will," she said. "The leg is irreparable. It's part of its character at this point." "I've been thinking about that," he said. The table. "I want to buy the building." She stared at him. "You want to buy the building?" "The whole block, actually. The dry cleaner next door is on a month-to-month lease. The pharmacy's been empty for 2 years. I have a contact at the city who can expedite the permits for commercial renovation. The rosewood stays." He paused. "The table stays. Diego? The radiator in your apartment also stays, but only in the sense that I'm replacing it with something that actually functions. I haven't told you about my radiator. Ana mentioned it." She put her face in her hands briefly, in the specific gesture of a person dealing with a situation that is overwhelming in a way that is not entirely unwelcome. "You can't just," she lowered her hands. "You can't buy things as a way of communicating feelings. That's not how this works." "It's the only vocabulary I know," he said. And it came out differently than she expected, not defensive. Not deflective, just honest. The particular honesty of a man identifying his own limitation with clear eyes and no performance of shame about it. I'm trying to learn different ones. She looked at him. Outside, it was May in Chicago, that specific, generous May that Chicago produces after a long winter, like it's apologizing, and the afternoon light was coming through the front window at an angle that made the cracked leather of the booth look, briefly, like something else, like something worth keeping. Start with less than a city block, she said. The building, she agreed. We'll see about the block, he nodded, and something settled in his expression. Not triumph, not calculation, but the quiet, specific relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has found a place to set a corner of it down. The coffee, he said. It's better every time. You have context now, she said. You know what you're tasting. I know, he said. That's exactly it. She refilled his cup. Old Pete Dalgleish, 3 seats down, turned a page of his newspaper without looking up, in the manner of a man who has seen enough of the world to know when something is beginning and has the wisdom to let it begin in peace. The kitchen door swung open and released a gust of heat and the smell of frying onions. Table 7 rocked, gently. Camilla Donovan rested her elbows on it, anyway. The case was formally closed in September, with no convictions tied to Diego Caruso personally. Patrick Holloway declined to comment. Richard Calloway didn't decline to comment, and was quoted briefly and precisely in the Tribune the following morning. Ana Torres's roastery, Torres and Company, expanded to a second location the following spring, in the River North space next to the Rosewood Grill, in a building whose new ownership had made the lease terms unusually favorable. The O in the Rosewood Grill's sign was fixed in July. Rosie Donovan's favorite color is still yellow. She was a waitress with a broken radiator and a $4 tip on a Thursday night. He was the most dangerous man in Chicago. She told him to his face what no bodyguard, no federal agent, and no judge had ever made him hear. And that 7-word sentence rewrote both of their lives. Because the truth is, the most powerful thing in any room is never the man with the most weapons or the most money. It's the person with nothing left to lose who chooses honesty anyway. Camilla Donovan didn't save Diego Caruso with love. She saved him with the radical, terrifying act of treating him like a person who could be corrected. And that is a love story. If this story hit you somewhere real, hit that like button right now, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe because we have more stories where extraordinary lives are hiding inside ordinary moments. Don't miss the next one.